They called him the liberator, the stranger, the twice-born. Yet before the torches, before the ivy, before the drunken songs that would echo through ages, there was only the sound of rain beating against the marble of Thebes and a flash of lightning tearing the night apart. In that storm, the mortal woman Semele held a secret too heavy for any human heart, that she carried within her the child of Zeus himself. Hera's jealousy moved like smoke through the cracks of heaven. She came disguised as an old midwife, her voice soft as honey but sharp as a blade, whispering questions meant to poison faith. "If he is truly a god," she murmured, "why does he hide his glory from you?" Semele listened, and doubt took root. One night she begged her divine lover to reveal himself as he truly was. Zeus hesitated. He had sworn an oath on the river Styx, and in keeping that promise, he doomed her. The curtains of the mortal world could not contain his light. Thunder rolled like an ocean breaking through the sky, and the sight of his unbridled form turned her body to ash. Yet within the smoke, something still pulsed, a tiny heartbeat that refused to stop. Grief-stricken, Zeus reached into the ruin and lifted the unborn child. To save him, the god tore open his own thigh and sowed the fragile spark inside. There, within living lightning, the infant grew. When the time came, he was born again, not from a mortal womb, but from the flesh of Olympus itself. That is why they called him the twice-born, a god who had tasted both mortality and eternity, one who would forever belong to neither. But Hera's vengeance did not die with Semele. She swore that the child who carried her rival's scent would never know peace. So Zeus hid him, changing his form into that of a girl, wrapping his divine scent in mortal disguise. Hermes took the newborn, swift and silent, over mountains veiled in mist to a secret grove known only to the nymphs of Nyssa. There, surrounded by vines and the hum of unseen waters, the child was raised in secrecy. The forest watched him grow. His laughter rippled through leaves heavy with dew, and wherever his feet pressed the soil, new shoots sprang to life. Ivy wild grape-tender stems that twined toward the sun, as though remembering some promise etched in divine blood. The nymphs sang him lullabies older than the Titans. They told him stories of gods who fell and rose again, of fire stolen and blood spilled, of cycles that never end. In those songs he heard a strange echo, his own. The gods would later say Dionysus was not merely born twice but countless times. For the Orphic poets whispered another tale, that before Semele there had been an older child, Zagreus, son of Zeus and Persephone, torn apart by jealous Titans. From his ashes, Zeus saved a single, glowing fragment, a heart, and placed it within Semele's womb. Thus the new Dionysus was born from death itself, carrying within him the pulse of that lost god. It was said that when he first opened his eyes, the heavens shuddered, recognizing an ancient soul returning. He was at once an infant and an echo, the heir of a god who had already died. In his small hands lay the promise of renewal and the threat of chaos. Night after night, storms rolled over Mount Nyssa. Fire and water danced together. Thunder became lullaby. The boy god dreamed of faces he did not know, of being torn apart and reborn, of laughter turning to screams and back again. He woke each morning with vines curling around his wrists, as if the earth itself longed to keep him close. When Hermes returned years later, he found not a child but something wild and radiant. Dionysus stood barefoot among the ivy, eyes like wine and sunlight mixed, holding a staff tipped with a pine cone, the first thyrsus. The air around him trembled. From the forest floor rose the scent of crushed grapes, though none had yet ripened. He smiled at the messenger and said only, "I have dreamed of fire, and it did not consume me." Thus began the wandering of the twice-born. The gods whispered that he walked in two worlds, his veins running with both mortal fragility and divine flame. He was proof that death could be undone, that life could spring from ruin. But he was also a reminder of the cost, that every birth carries the memory of destruction, that even a god can be scarred by the thunder that made him. And so, from the ashes of Semele and the wound of Zeus, Dionysus emerged, the child of contradiction, the promise of transformation. His story, like the wine that would one day bear his name, began in bitterness before it turned to sweetness. And beneath every sweetness, the aftertaste of smoke remained. He was born from fire, but his first breath carried the scent of rain. The forests raised him, the rivers whispered his name. Yet even as the ivy crowned his hair, and the beasts bowed their heads in calm recognition, Dionysus was not at home in any one world. Olympus saw him as an intruder. Mortals saw him as a god in disguise. To both, he was the stranger who came from the east, a shimmering reflection that refused to stay still. As he wandered, the young god began to change. In the oldest carvings, he is a broad-shouldered man, crowned with vine leaves, eyes stern like those of his father Zeus. But time reshaped him. Slowly the beard disappeared, the muscles softened, the robe loosened into flowing silk. His face became a mirror where both man and woman might see themselves. His beauty unsettled even the gods, for it was not born of perfection, but of contradiction. Strength veiled in tenderness, joy shadowed by danger. He dressed himself in purples and crimsons, the colors of crushed grapes and spilled blood. Over his shoulders hung the skins of panthers and leopards, symbols of untamed desire. Around him coiled serpents, not in menace, but as living bracelets, marking him as kin to the earth's hidden pulse. Wherever he walked, vines broke through stone. The air behind him shimmered with invisible drums, and laughter followed like perfume. But for all his radiance, Hera's hatred did not fade. She recognized in Dionysus the proof of her husband's betrayal, and in his mortal half, a weakness she could exploit. Her fury took the form of madness. One by one she sent visions into the mind of the boy god. Visions of fire, of death, of limbs scattered and reassembled. He fled through foreign lands, across rivers and deserts, never staying long enough for roots to take hold. It was during these wanderings that Dionysus met Silenus, the ancient satyr, old as time, with the belly of a drunkard and the eyes of a sage. Silenus found him lost in the mountains, trembling with exhaustion. He offered him a cup of wine and said, "Drink, little god. It will not cure your sorrow, but it will teach you how to sing through it." Dionysus drank, and for the first time, laughter bloomed in his chest. The taste was like sunlight filtered through leaves, sharp, sweet, and burning all at once. Silenus became his teacher, his foster father, and his mirror. Together they wandered from valley to valley, spreading the strange magic of fermented fruit. They taught mortals how to press grapes, how to wait, how to turn decay into delight. "This," Silenus would say, lifting a cup, "is the lesson of life itself. You must let what dies ferment before it can become something divine." Soon, followers began to gather. The satyrs, half beast and half man, whose laughter echoed through the woods. The maenads, women possessed by a holy frenzy, their hair crowned in ivy, their feet bare upon the earth. They called themselves his family, though none shared his blood. To them, Dionysus was not a god of Olympus, but of the wild, a god who knew sorrow and turned it into song. Together they danced beneath the moon, torches in hand, chanting his name until the stars seemed to pulse to their rhythm. The ground shook with the beat of their drums, and mortals who watched from afar felt both fascination and dread. For in their joy there was something frightening, a sense that order itself might dissolve if the music went on too long. The Olympians watched with unease. Zeus, proud but distant, tolerated his son's wandering. Hera seethed. Athena called the rites madness. Apollo, whose music sought harmony, could not understand a melody that rejoiced in chaos. But Dionysus did not seek approval. He did not fit in marble halls or on thrones. His kingdom was the liminal space, between sanity and ecstasy, between life and the slow decay that feeds it. And yet, He was not cruel. When mortals prayed for relief from grief, he gave them wine. When kings demanded obedience, he offered them freedom. But freedom, he taught, was a double-edged gift. It could heal or it could destroy. To taste it without reverence was to invite madness, the same madness Hera had once unleashed upon him. Still, the god smiled. "They fear what they cannot name," he said to Silenus one night, as they watched the firelight flicker across sleeping Maenads. "They build walls around their hearts and call them temples. I only ask that they open the door." Silenus chuckled, his words slurred but true. "And when they do?" "Then they will see themselves," Dionysus whispered. "And that is what terrifies them most." In time, his legend spread beyond mountains and rivers. Artists carved his likeness in temples, though each image contradicted the last. In one, he is bearded and majestic. In another, youthful and androgynous. In yet another, a wild figure crowned in ivy, eyes glowing with otherworldly light. None could define him because he refused to be defined. His divinity was not in what he was, but in how he changed. And so he walked between worlds, neither mortal nor immortal, neither man nor woman, neither savior nor destroyer. He was the reflection that shifted as you looked, the truth that unraveled as you tried to hold it. On Olympus, they called him the god of wine. But the satyrs and maenads who danced in his honor knew better. They called him something older, something untranslatable. The god of the thin place, where masks fall away and everything becomes everything else. That was the true beginning of Dionysus, not the birth from fire, but the moment he learned that identity itself was just another kind of disguise, and that to live freely, one must first dare to be unrecognizable. When the twice-born finally returned to the city of his mortal mother, he did not come as a conqueror, but as a whisper in the wind. Thebes lay quiet beneath its high walls, the same city where Semele had burned for love of a god. Dionysus stood on its outskirts, his eyes reflecting both sorrow and curiosity. He carried no army, only the rhythm of drums and the slow scent of ripening grapes. Around him moved his maenads and satyrs, a procession of torches and laughter that looked more like a dream than an invasion. Thebes had forgotten him. The people drank wine but no longer remembered the name behind its sweetness. And their young king, Pentheus, proud and rigid, saw in the new god's rites nothing but madness. When word reached him that women had left their homes to dance in the mountains, to sing wild songs beneath the moon, his face hardened. "They abandon their families," he said, "and call it worship. They lose themselves and call it divine." He summoned his guards. "Find this stranger who calls himself a god. Bind him in chains, and I will show Thebes that order still rules." That night, as torches flickered in the courtyards, Dionysus entered the city in the guise of a mortal priest. His hair was bound, his robe flowing, his voice soft as the rustle of leaves. The guards seized him easily, a youth too delicate to resist, and brought him before Pentheus. The king studied him with disdain. "So," Pentheus sneered, "you are the one who leads our women into frenzy. You, with your painted face and your flowing hair, you claim divinity. You are no god, only a fool who hides behind perfume and lies." Dionysus smiled, a calm, unsettling smile. "You see only what you fear to become," he said quietly, "but there are truths you cannot chain." "Enough riddles," snapped Pentheus. "You will rot in the dungeons until your madness fades." Chains closed around the god's wrists, cold iron biting into immortal skin. Yet as he was led away, Dionysus laughed, a laugh that rolled like distant thunder. That night the palace walls began to tremble. Flames danced without consuming. Vines broke through the marble floors. From the windows came the sound of flutes, though no musician played. The guards fled in terror, and the prisoner vanished from his cell as though the air itself had unbound him. When dawn broke, Dionysus appeared again before the bewildered king, unharmed, unshaken. "Your house trembles," Because you defy what you do not understand, he said. Would you see my rites with your own eyes? Would you judge them fairly? Pentheus, still drunk on pride, hesitated. Curiosity whispered to him. If I disguise myself, he thought, I can expose their depravity, see their crimes. Dionysus bowed slightly, as if reading his mind. Then come, he said. But to walk among my followers, you must look as they do. Under the god's guidance, Pentheus was dressed in the garb of a Maenad, long linen robes, a wreath of ivy, a veil that hid his stern face. When he looked into the mirror, he barely recognized himself. For a moment, he felt a tremor of something strange. Not fear, but release. The god touched his shoulder. Now you are ready, he said. They went together to the slopes of Mount Cithaeron, where the Maenads danced among the trees. The air was thick with music and the smell of pine resin. The women whirled, their hair loose, their cries blending with the beating of drums. Pentheus, hidden among them, watched with fascination. Their movements were wild, but not chaotic. Their joy had a rhythm, their madness, a strange harmony. What do you see? Dionysus whispered. Pentheus hesitated. I see beauty and danger. Then you begin to understand, said the god. But hubris dies hard. The king stepped forward, eager to assert control. Behold your ruler, he shouted, tearing away his veil. This madness ends now. The music stopped. A silence thicker than air fell over the clearing. The Maenads turned. For an instant, their faces were calm. Then their eyes blazed with divine fury. In Pentheus they saw not a king but a beast, a threat to the sacred dance. Dionysus stepped back, his expression unreadable. You wished to see a god's power, he murmured. Now you will. A scream split the air. The women descended upon him in a frenzy. Ivy turned to iron in their hands, fingers became claws. They tore at the false Maenad's robes, at his skin, until his cries echoed through the valley. And at the front of the madness was Agave, his own mother, blinded by ecstasy, believing she hunted a lion sent by the gods. When the dawn came, she carried his head back to Thebes in triumph, until the divine fog lifted, and she saw what she had done. Thus ended the king who mocked the god of release. In that tragedy, the Greeks saw a warning written in blood, that those who deny ecstasy invite destruction, that repression is only another mask for fear. For Dionysus, it was not victory, but fulfillment of law, the balance he embodied. He did not destroy out of cruelty. He revealed what lay hidden. Pentheus sought to control, and control turned to chaos. The same vine that brings sweetness can choke a tree. The same wine that soothes can drive one to madness. When the people of Thebes buried their king, they built no monument. Only silence remained, and the faint echo of flutes that seemed to drift from the mountains. Some said it was the wind, others knew better. In later years, when mortals lifted their cups to Dionysus, they remembered that silence as much as the joy that preceded it. For in his rites, joy and terror were never far apart, two halves of the same heartbeat, pulsing beneath the skin of the world. The gods are not constant. They are tides, receding, surging, reshaping what they touch. Dionysus, more than any, understood this. After Thebes, he wandered again, across seas, through cities, through hearts. He brought both ruin and renewal, mercy and madness, and wherever he went, mortals learned that joy has a cost. It was on the island of Naxos that he found Ariadne, lying abandoned on the sand. The sea whispered around her like mockery. She had betrayed her father, King Minos, for love of the hero Theseus. She had led the Athenian through the labyrinth, helped him slay the Minotaur, and fled her home for a promise of marriage. But promises are frail things. While she slept, Theseus sailed away. The ship grew smaller, then vanished into the horizon, leaving her with nothing but the salt of tears. When Dionysus saw her, she did not stir. Her breath was shallow, her face turned to the sea. Something in her stillness spoke to him, the memory of all who had been broken by love. He knelt beside her and brushed the sand from her hair. "Wake," he said softly. "You have not been forsaken." Ariadne opened her eyes, expecting cruelty, finding instead a gaze that held the warmth of fire without the pain of burning. Dionysus lifted her, clothed her in purple, and placed upon her brow a golden crown. "This," he said, "is not an ending. The gods do not waste sorrow." When her mortal years faded, he took her hand again and led her into the heavens. Her crown became a constellation, Corona Borealis, so that no one would ever forget the woman who was redeemed by despair. But mercy was never his only lesson. There was a time when sailors saw a youth alone upon the shore, radiant and calm. Thinking him a prince worth ransoming, they seized him and set sail. Yet the helmsman, an old seafarer with eyes made wise by storms, trembled. "Release him," he warned. "There is power in that silence." The crew laughed. They bound the stranger to the mast, boasting of the gold he would bring. But soon the air thickened. The sea turned glassy still. From the planks of the ship sprouted vines, heavy with grapes, winding through the rigging, blooming in impossible abundance. Ivy burst from the oars. The sailors hacked at it in panic, but the greenery grew faster than their blades could cut. Then came the roar, low, ancient, and terrible. A lion stood at the bow, eyes gleaming like molten gold. A bear clawed its way from the shadows. The sailors screamed, throwing themselves into the sea. The stranger only watched, his expression unreadable. Those who drowned were lost. Those who repented, he changed. Their limbs curved, their cries turned to clicks and whistles, and they became dolphins, forever condemned to serve as guides to lost sailors. Only the helmsman, who had recognized the god, was spared untouched. Dionysus left the ship drifting under a ceiling of vines. It would be found years later, still green and blooming, a garden adrift on the sea. The Olympians too once learned his gentler cunning. When Hera, queen of heaven, was trapped on a throne of her own son's making, no god could free her. Hephaestus, bitter from rejection, had forged a golden seat that bound her fast the moment she touched it. Neither Ares' fury nor Hermes' persuasion could sway him. "Let her stay there," he said. "Let her taste the helplessness she gave me." It was Dionysus who approached the forge. He brought no weapons, only a wineskin. "Drink with me, brother," he said. The smith hesitated, but curiosity and the sweet smell of the drink overcame pride. 1 cup became 2, then 10. The god of fire laughed for the first time in centuries, his hammer forgotten. Dionysus draped an arm around his shoulder and led him, singing, up the slope to Olympus. When they arrived, Hephaestus was too drunk to resist. He released his mother, and laughter filled the heavens. "See," said Dionysus, smiling into his cup, "not all chains must be broken by force." But not every mortal learned so easily. In Phrygia, there lived a king named Midas, rich beyond measure yet hungry for more. One night, his servants found a stranger asleep in the royal garden, none other than old Silenus, Dionysus's beloved companion. Rather than cast the drunkard out, Midas honored him, offering food and shelter for 10 days and nights. When Dionysus arrived to retrieve his lost friend, he was moved by the king's kindness. "Ask for what you wish," he said, "and it shall be yours." Without thought, Midas spoke. "Grant that everything I touch may turn to gold." At first, joy. Trees shimmered as coins. Pebbles glittered as treasure. But when he lifted food to his mouth, it hardened between his teeth. When he embraced his daughter, her heartbeat ceased. Her skin turned cold and metallic. In despair, he cried out to Dionysus for mercy. The god appeared, not in anger but in quiet pity. "Go to the river Pactolus," he said. "Wash your hands there, and the curse will pass from you." Midas obeyed. The river's sands turned forever golden from that day, a reminder that desire is a mirror. It shows you what you already are. 4 stories, 4 judgments, yet each, in its way, was an act of grace. Dionysus punished the arrogant, healed the faithful, and forgave the foolish. His justice was never simple. It was liquid, like the wine that bore his name, capable of soothing or destroying, depending on how deeply one drank. Wherever he walked, he left behind the same paradox, a cup filled with both salvation and ruin. For Dionysus was not the god of wine alone, but of all transformations that test the soul. He had given Ariadne a crown and Pentheus a lesson. He had turned murderers into dolphins and melted vengeance into laughter. He had shown mortals that joy without reverence is madness, but also that madness might be the first step toward truth. In his wake, the world shimmered between opposites, and always, in the fading echo of the drums, came the same whisper, half blessing, half warning, drink deeply, but remember who you are. By the time the wanderer returned to Olympus, the scent of wine had already reached its marble gates. He came not as a stranger now, but as something the gods could no longer ignore. His rites had spread through valleys and cities, his name sung by peasants and kings alike. Some worshipped him with laughter, others with trembling. Yet all felt his presence. He had become the pulse beneath the world's order, unpredictable, irresistible. But when Dionysus stepped into the golden hall, silence met him. Hera turned her face away. Athena's gaze was cool, Apollo's measured. The air smelled faintly of ozone, as if lightning remembered old sins. For a moment, the twice-born stood alone. Then Zeus rose from his throne, his expression unreadable. "You were born of fire," he said, "and from fire you bring both ruin and rebirth. Olympus has mocked you, but I will not. Sit among us." And thus, for the first time, the god of chaos was given a seat among the keepers of order. The 13th Olympian, the one who blurred the lines between mortal and divine. The others watched uneasily, yet none dared object. For even they, in the stillness of their hearts, had felt his touch, the tremor of uncertainty that precedes creation. Dionysus bowed, but his eyes wandered toward the mortal world. "I am of both realms," he whispered. "I belong where the veil is thin." And so, though he was granted his place among the gods, he never stayed long. He returned to the fields, to the forests, to the hearts of those who still sought him, the broken, the joyous, the mad. For his kingdom was not Olympus. It was the moment before surrender, where control dissolves into truth. It was during one of these wanderings that he met Ampelos, a youth whose laughter was like sunlight scattered on water. The god loved him dearly, for in Ampelos he saw innocence untouched by pride. They raced through vineyards, wrestled under the shade of fig trees, and slept beneath stars that hummed with distant music. But the world is jealous of beauty. One morning, Ampelos climbed upon a bull's back, boasting that even beasts bowed to him. The animal reared, throwing him to the ground. He fell, struck by his own hubris, and by the cruel necessity of the gods' lessons. Dionysus held him as his life ebbed away. From his lover's blood, he raised the first vine, teaching mortals that pleasure is born from fragility. "Remember," he said, pressing a cluster of grapes into his palm. "This sweetness exists because something once died." And when the first wine was poured, it carried within it both laughter and mourning, the taste of loss transformed. From then on, Dionysus was not only the god of ecstasy, but of memory. Each cup lifted in his honor became a small resurrection, each festival a rehearsal for the end of sorrow. Through him, mortals learned that what breaks can bloom again, that even ruin can sing. Yet as centuries passed, his image dimmed. In comedies, they painted him as a drunken fool, a soft and foolish god staggering under his own cup. They forgot the fire behind the laughter, the wisdom behind the madness. Temples crumbled, but his spirit did not vanish. It merely changed shape as he always had. In Athens, the great theater festivals, the city Dionysia, became his new altar. Every tragedy, every comedy, began with an invocation to him. When actors stepped onto the stage and donned their masks, they were reenacting his mystery, transformation itself. For in every performance, a mortal became someone else, and in doing so, came closer to the divine. The theater was his temple, the mask his sacrament. Through art, he lived. Even the philosophers could not silence him. Long after the last hymn faded, Nietzsche would speak of him again, as the eternal counterpart to Apollo. Where Apollo represented clarity, logic, and control, Dionysus embodied passion, chaos, and the raw energy of creation. Without the Dionysian, Nietzsche wrote, life itself would wither into stone. It was the same truth the ancients had whispered with torches in hand, that madness is not the absence of reason, but its mirror, the spark that keeps the world alive. And so, the god who began as an outcast became the heartbeat of Western art, the rhythm beneath every song, every dance, every story where boundaries blur and souls transform. You can still find him if you know where to look, in the music that makes strangers embrace in the theater, when the lights go down and a hush falls over the crowd in the clinking of glasses, raised to forget and to remember. For Dionysus never truly left. He simply changed his mask again. And maybe that is the lesson he leaves us with, that life is a ritual of transformation, and each of us is twice born, once into the body and once into awareness. Between those births lies every ecstasy, every heartbreak, every moment when we lose ourselves just to find something greater. Listen closely, and you can still hear his whisper at the edge of sleep. Do not fear the blur between joy and madness. It is the place where gods are made. The drums fade. The torches burn low. In the quiet, you see the reflection of your own face, half in shadow, half in flame. The mask slips, and for a heartbeat, you feel what Dionysus felt, that the world is not divided at all, that order and chaos are only two breaths of the same eternal song. And when the night finally closes, it does not feel like an ending. Only the soft exhale of wine upon the earth, the promise that everything broken will bloom again.